Welcome back. You're watching a special year-end edition of The World This Year here on France 24, and we're looking at it all with Christopher Dickey of Newsweek and The Daily Beast. From Le Plus Nouvelle Ops, I guess you could say the citizen journalist arm of French news weekly Le Nouvel Observateur, Aude Baron, Patrick Smith of the Africa Report, and Stephen Erlinger of the New York Times. Of course, the difficult part with a show like this is it's all about arbitration. Here's just a sample of some of the stories that we saw in 2011. Of course, there was in March the terrible earthquake in Japan and the ensuing debate over the safety of nuclear energy. In April, the ouster, with the helping of French and UN forces of Laurent Gbagbo. There was a royal wedding over in London. Kate and Will's. Osama bin Laden, almost an anecdote by the time he was captured and killed, rather, on May the 1st, just 100 kilometers outside the Pakistani capital. Lionel Messi worked his magic as Barcelona did the double, the Champions League and the Spanish title. Then there was the surprise out of Russia with the first chinks in the armor of Vladimir Putin's reign on the heels of him announcing that he'll be running again for president in 2012. Now, if the Arab Spring has drawn parallels with Europe circa 1968, it's because, as we mentioned in part one, of the youth. The uprising in Prague at the time, the student demonstrations in France, Germany, and elsewhere coincided with the baby boomer generation coming of age and coming to power. Today, that baby boomer generation is reaching retirement age, only to discover, well, that it's been living above its means. What started as a credit crunch has now emptied state coffers, and it's payback time.
Así nos va a quedar la cara si realmente no les ponemos freno.
What did you say exactly to Mr. Berlusconi? Did he make any pledges?
Des engagements sur de nouvelles réformes en Italie.
Questi problemi per cui esprimiamo tutta la nostra solidarietà per gli attacchi civili.
I went to Brussels with one objective, to protect Britain's national interest, and that is what I did.
It's all coming undone, Stephen Erlinger.
Well, what you said reminded me of what Oscar Wilde said as he was lying in a very expensive Paris hotel dying. He said, "Alas, I'm dying beyond my means." And I feel that way a little bit about the euro. I don't think it's going to collapse, but it is in deep trouble. And the summit in Brussels, where we stayed up all night long, you know, deals with the future. It doesn't deal with the current problem. The current problem is the markets want to see money behind the pledge to defend the euro and to defend Italy. And that's not visible. So I'm very unhappy. I think we'll get through into the new year, but the first 3 months of the new year, there's billions and billions and billions of euros to refinance. And we'll see how the markets respond. I think this has been a crisis that started with fraud in Greece and became an institutional, a banking, a structural crisis. It calls into question the European project that was built with such pain and care after the Second World War. It has isolated Britain from the continent in a way I don't think is very useful. And Germany is remaking the EU on its own recipe. And that's very interesting, too. Now we see the effect of the enlargement of Germany, which France was so skeptical about, and which the euro was designed as a kind of response to. But it's a mixture of lack of discipline. It's a mixture of political ideas triumphing over economic skepticism. And it is also a function, let's be honest, of this continuing crisis that began in the United States with Lehman Brothers, because that set off the crash that the challenge to the euro is only the third or fourth chapter of.
All right, and there's more to come. Aude Baron, when you speak with people, is there this sense of a disconnect between the the public discourse about now that the recipe seems to be more Europe?
Well, people, are just all simply despaired. And when you listen to them, when you read what they write on the internet, you really feel that they don't know where they have to go. And regarding to Europe, there's a feeling of being not abandoned, but ununderstood. I mean, when you have so many debate about Europe and trying to explain very simply to people, okay, Europe is this. You have only one definition, and we are going to do this. And it's always very difficult to make people explain in very simple words what's going to be. And so people, they just they don't understand Europe anymore. You really feel there's a great disconnection. And that's why they are so angry. And it's especially when you look at the youth, people who were born after 1975 and who are between 25 and 35. And that's especially where the protests come from. I say we because I'm also under 35, but we've always lived with the word unemployment, with the word crisis, with the word difficult. And when you look beyond at our grandparents, and for them, everything is quite safe. And people of the younger generation are just tired of everything. And now they are fed up with, all these dramatical words, and they want positive things, but they don't know what's positive. And they're seeking for something, and they're looking for solutions. And the biggest problem is politicians, they don't have solutions. And so that's where there's the lack.
And the politicians in this country are old, most of them.
And maybe that's because they don't understand them.
We don't call that old.
But what I think was interesting when you were talking about the baby boomers being behind the protests in '68, it's just interesting what they inherited. They inherited a world in which their parents had sacrificed everything to keep Europe free, and indeed much of the rest of the world free. They came into that. And this new wave of protest, the youthful protest around the world, is they're the children of parents who've had it good for 30 years. And I think there's a big theme of moral responsibility here. The baby boomers have to, a large extent, and I count myself as one of them, let the future generations down. And all this disparaging talk we used to hear, oh, our kids don't go out and demonstrate. We were demonstrating against the Vietnam War and so on. The kids today aren't interested. I think a lot of that is a terrible conceit. It has changed. And I think the baby boom generation is in trial in a way. And the youth do represent a very important challenge to that myth, that mythology.
Well, when Aude was going down the list of words that people have grown up with, the one word they haven't grown up with in any significant sense in Europe is war. And one of the things that we see is that for the older generation, the generation that's even older than us, the fact that there was no war was hugely important. Mm-hmm. That was the driving force in creating Europe. To end the wars that had plagued the continent for thousands of years. And they succeeded. But that doesn't have much resonance in the minds of people who were born after 1975. They want to look to the future, not to how they've overcome the past. And this is actually the problem we see around the world, is that the idea of what the future might be just doesn't look that interesting anymore. And it isn't enough to say we've overcome the past. It's to say, how are we going to build the future? The problem with the protest movements is that they don't have a very clear idea of how to build the future either. They may be protesting, but it's mainly against us. It's not to articulate a vision of what should be coming in the years, in future years.
I agree with that. I would also say, don't feel bad that you haven't seen war, but you've also, you live in a country that has huge and perennial youth unemployment. That's a structural problem. Spain has 45% youth unemployment. I mean, there needs to be a liberalizing of these huge European welfare states to make room for young people who are educated, who are intelligent, who live from one stage to another. And it's a disgrace. I think it's a disgrace.
Well, it's also in Southern Europe particularly, you've got this situation where the government is supposed to take care of all these people, and it's also not supposed to tax anybody. I mean, there have been huge demonstrations going on in Italy against what? Against property taxes. Because you don't have to pay taxes on your first house or on your second house. And now under the austerity government, they're saying, yes, maybe you should pay some taxes. And people are going, oh, no, income taxes. Who pays income taxes?
But maybe because you need a government who's a model, and maybe that's one of the problems. Maybe people are ready, you know, to make some efforts, but they want the government to be a model. For example, in France, there was a debate about the salaries and the retirement of the deputies. And the deputies, they say, no, we don't want to lower our salaries. And maybe if they accepted, you know, maybe if they make the first step, and okay, that's hard for them, but after, you know, maybe people will follow them.
Well, exactly. The most egregious example was Berlusconi. What kind of model was he in Italy? He was a model for corruption.
Speaking of political models, in 2011, a crime story out of Manhattan changed politics in this country forever. Christopher Dickey, Dominique...
I think I was in that crowd, isn't it?
Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the former head of the IMF now, heading to Manhattan court. He was cleared of sex charges, but he still faces other problems. But in this country, it's opened the lid on a wider question, which is the fact that elites are often treated with kid gloves, most notably when it comes to gender relations.
Yes. I mean, I think that one of the things that's interesting about the sort of later developments in the Strauss-Kahn case is the remarks attributed to him by his semi-official biographer. And he's sort of saying, well, you know, why are they bothering with this stuff? I mean, it's only because of this ridiculous incident with the maid in the Sofitel in New York that all this has come out. This was, and he's essentially saying, all this that we're doing, the life of a libertine politician, was just perfectly normal here in France, and nobody talked about it before. And so he's trying to sort of blame the media, typically, for making people talk, unfortunately, about the libertine life of French politicians.
Was there a generation gap in your newsroom when it came to covering this story?
No, not really a generation gap, but there was more a debate about the privacy and what you were talking about. And in France, the line is, we have to admit, in France, we don't talk about privacy when it remains, you know, private life. But in this case, the difference, it's GSK privacy became public, and it had public matters and public consequences. For example, he was the president of the FMI, and with that story, he gave a very bad image in France all over the world. So you just had to get interest, and it wasn't a matter of, you know, did he cheat on his wife? There were accusations of rape. So you just have to know. And when this man could be, you know, the president of France, people are, you know, just have the right to know who is that guy.
Well, and it's a mistake to think that these things don't have political implications in France, even where it's kept quiet. I mean, when I asked somebody very close to President Sarkozy the day the news broke about Strauss-Kahn, is this a plot? And he said, no. I said, you sure? It seems to work so well for Sarkozy. And he says, no, too early. Because they had so much dirt on Strauss-Kahn. But they were waiting.
It was in D.C. shortly after this, talking to some people in the IMF, and they saying, it's amazing, you know, the stories going around about DSK within the building. No one had ever talked about that. But, you know, again, it was the kind of the story like the reporter from Libération. We don't ever get in an elevator with him alone and all that sort of thing. That was common currency in the IMF and the World Bank. No one, until that time, had bothered to out that. I think it's going to have a huge effect, both in those institutions and in political culture in France, in terms of the media's activism in looking at this kind of stuff.
All right, and before we go, just how we've been talking about the media, just how much the digital revolutions helped shape all the stories we've been discussing. It's particularly illustrated by the planetary grieving of the passing of an inventor who sparked tributes worthy of any great rock star. It was just amazing to see that Steve Erlanger, people getting all worked up on the day Steve Jobs died about for or against his Mac products.
Well, I think there was a religious element to it, I have to say, almost like the death of an idol. I mean, he was not a very nice man. He didn't give much money away. I mean, he wasn't Bill Gates. He was very private. he probably brought his own death closer through mad theories of how to treat it. But he was a great pioneer of design. I think he's made our world more beautiful, and I really admire him for that. The interfaces, the elegance of the products, they weren't always the best technically, but they always have been the most beautiful. And around him there grew a cult, and there grew a cult of Apple, and it continues. And the big question is, will the company keep it up or not? But I mean, there's some people who actually changed the way we deal with the world, and he was one of them.
And Steve Jobs' last year on Earth, also the last year for what had been a British institution for more than a century and a half. The news of the world, and its boss Rupert Murdoch preferring to call it a day than face the shame of a phone hacking scandal, which again brought us back to the question of how we get our news and from whom. Patrick Smith, when you weigh up those two events, on the one hand, this new media icon who is feted for his death, and on the other hand, Britain's tabloid press getting rung through the system, you see that it really is an evolving world in that respect.
I think the linkage between the two is it was the internet, it was the Facebook sites, the Twitter sites, and so on that pushed the Murdoch story, and the newspaper did a lot of investigative work, particularly the Guardian in Britain and the New York Times in the States, that were looking at Murdoch, I have to say, for their own interests. I mean, they're deadly rivals of the Murdoch empire, so they had every reason to do, but they did an incredibly good investigation of that, and they used all the new media to propagate that investigation. And so stories were winging around, some of them actually completely incorrect. Didn't matter. It pushed the impetus against Murdoch, and it gave politicians, particularly in Britain, the guts to stand up for once to the Murdoch empire. So I think he was sort of mugged by new media in a way, and a lot of people would say the press is a better thing for it. And
we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you, Patrick Smith, Christopher Dickey, Aude Baron, and Stephen Erlinger, and thank you for joining us for The World This Week, or The World This Year. We leave you with the sounds of somebody who left us in 2011, Amy Winehouse, in one of her last recordings in the company of Tony Bennett.
My heart is sad and lonely. For you I sigh, for you, dear, only. Why haven't you seen it? I'm all for you, body and soul.
I spend my days in a hungry